All right, so let's just quickly remind everybody of what we've got going on. So this week we are finishing up Chapter 7 today, and we'll go through Chapter 8 next week. Next weekend, your Unit 2 exam is open, as well as your midterm question paper is due. So with that, I definitely recommend you work on your question paper earlier rather than later, so you're not trying to cram for both a test and a paper at the same time next weekend. So as a reminder, that exam will be completely multiple choice through Canvas. It'll be open those 2 days. You'll have a time limit, open notes, open book, very similar to the first one. So, and then the study guide is available. Hopefully we'll have time to cover more of the study guide after Chapter 8. That's my plan, is to dedicate some more additional time, even if we have to skip a couple of the topics at the end of Chapter 8. But I think we'll be able to get through Chapter 8 and have that time. If not, though, we'll do some more study guide than we did for Chapter 1. All right, well, let's jump into our content. We were talking about disabilities and neurodivergence. We really quickly went through the autism spectrum disorders. So we're going to watch a video first thing today from someone who was diagnosed with autism and talk about their own experience and how their neurodivergence is helpful in some ways, and it made some things difficult for them in life. So hopefully that's a good review of autism. You might also want to review your notes for, we talked about dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, and ADHD. So you'll probably want to review your notes for those as well before we're going to jump into an activity in a little bit. So we'll watch this video, discussions about neurodiversity and how it's affected this person, and then we will do an activity after that. And so I'll describe that then. I'm going to speed it up a little bit. So just let me know if it is too fast for you. In the chat, just type out that it's a little too quick or something like that. Hopefully it's all right.
My name is Elisabeth Wiklander, and I am autistic. What do you think about when you hear the word autistic? How do you react when you hear the word autism? Would you say that it is a lifelong disorder, an impairment, a disability? This is indeed the way medical language describes it, but autism is so much more than that. No diagnostic manual can truly explain the multifaceted experience of autism. It is a neurological difference with a vast spectrum of representation within its population. It can come with remarkable gifts and skills, as well as devastating traits. But autism doesn't necessarily equal disability. And thankfully, today we have a word that challenges this negative terminology: neurodiversity. Neurodiversity describes how diverse we are as human beings from a neurological perspective. It suggests that the many variations of human brains, like autistic ones, should be accepted as a natural and valuable part of humanity's genetic legacy. DNA shows us that autism is primarily a genetic condition, something that has been passed down through generations and is still widely shared in the general population. These genes can carry something so positive, in spite of the difference they cause, that they have persisted throughout our evolution and still flourish today. Some of our important inventions, pieces of art and music, and discoveries in scientific fields that have moved our world forwards come from autistic minds. With today's exciting new technologies in neuroscience, we have seen that autistic brains differ from the norm. Not only that, but it appears as if each and every one differs in its own unique way. So autism is rich in expression, but still faces limiting generalizations. Today, I want to talk about the autism that I display. the one that blends with normality and can have catastrophic impacts on people's lives, not necessarily because of the autism itself, but because of the ignorance of it, or the failure to recognize that it is there in the first place, as I eventually would discover. Now, in social situations, we do have expectations upon one another. We use a certain kind of rule book, which, when followed, rewards us with social acceptance. But I always felt that I was different. The trouble was I couldn't explain how, and certainly not why. It felt as if I had been provided a different rule book, and that I lacked a community to fall back upon that could confirm to me that the way I interpreted the world was valid too. So I grew up feeling very misunderstood by pretty much everybody, even within my own family. If I applied what would have been my motives, my intentions, upon someone else's behavior, or vice versa, the outcome was often negative and very confusing. So to me, the social world became scary and unpredictable. Now, I did notice, however, especially during my school years here in Sweden, that my mind had been blessed with gifts, like analytical skills, an intense mental focus, high capacity for memorizing information, which made studying very pleasurable and easy. So in my academic pursuit, I came here to Gothenburg, where I studied at the university. I later went to the Netherlands, where I attained my Master of Music. And today, I live in the UK, working as a professional cellist in the London Philharmonic Orchestra, touring the world. But this, however, is quite unusual for me, to stand on a stage just talking to you without my instrument. I can't help the feeling that I have forgotten it somewhere. Okay, so one may now think, okay, she plays in this great orchestra. She's obviously done pretty well for herself. What's the problem? Well, I have a very literal mind. And it constantly clashes with both non-verbal and verbal subtleties in social situations. It gives me a very direct line of approach and speech in everyday conversations. I still don't really understand the purpose of small talk, although I can appreciate it now. And jokes and sarcasm fly completely over my head. My mind just takes things in so literally. It loves to analyze everything. My world is a very intense one. My senses are heightened. My brain absorbs everything in through an amplifier. My special interests can completely consume me. And my emotions, they go from the highest of high to the lowest of low, and they're on and off like a light switch. My family, bless them, they can still stand in utter disbelief when I go from a complete nuclear blast to rainbows and butterflies in less than 2 seconds, literally. So, okay, autism influences my thoughts, my imagination, my senses, my emotions, and the way I process information. But without knowing this, it was very difficult to maintain friendships because our social expectations were so different. I could come across as odd, and I experienced a good amount of bullying for it. But the most devastating were the eroding misunderstandings that dominated the relationships with the people closest to me. Body signals, misread. Words, completely misinterpreted. It was so frustrating. It was like fighting a ghost, something that no one could really grasp, not even the counselors we sought for help. So it was a mentally agonizing situation that persisted year after year. And in my mid-20s, I had reached a really dark place. And I started to be truly scared for my future. But then, something extraordinary happened that changed everything. In 2006, I heard about Asperger's syndrome. It is already an outdated term today, but it is still a form of autism on the high-functioning end of the spectrum. 3 years later, when I was 28 years old, I received this diagnosis. And I realized that a good third of my life had been based upon a false perception of myself. Imagine that. No wonder my life had been so confusing. But now I started to see myself in a new, clear context. My whole life and all my experiences just started to make sense. This launched me on an incredible journey of enlightenment and transformation. I had finally been given something that allowed me to explore the relativity of my perception of the world compared to others. I gained access into that mysterious rule book, and I could start comparing it with mine. And so I learned to identify my differences. So in the coming years, I found efficient ways to improve my social skills. I learned to verbalize my needs, recognize my limitations, and develop my strengths. I founded successful strategies to navigate my everyday life and significantly improved all the disabling traits of my diagnosis. But this took a lot of commitment, dedication, and hard work. Because autism is a spectrum, I had to become like a researcher and collect a lot of information from a lot of different sources over a long period of time in order to be able to complete my unique life puzzle. When I thought that I had reached the level of conformity that society demanded.
So, obviously there's more to this video, but those were the main points that I wanted to get across from this discussion. So last time we talked about how individual in a school setting, individual attention and scaffolding for kids with dyslexia, ADHD, autism can be really helpful. And a lot of that is because of essentially what she was saying there at the end. It gives them skills that work for them individually. So for anyone who's neurodivergent, figuring out with therapy, with interventions, with asking other people who have the same diagnosis, figuring out different tools and techniques that help any individual to thrive with their own set of skills. And so that can take a long time. Hopefully, anybody who's diagnosed has a good therapist who has a bunch of different ideas on different techniques and tools and trainings that can help them figure it out quicker. But that's not always what happens. So being able to have multiple kinds of doctors and talk to multiple different kinds of people who have a similar diagnosis can really help to figure out, one, how your brain works and how to use those skills and the talents that it has and capitalize on those, essentially. So not necessarily to become more seeming neurotypical or not to seem as neurotypical, but just to do the things that you would want to do better and use your brain in a way that you would want it to be used to do whatever kind of pursuits that you want to do. So hopefully those examples make it really clear some of the difficulties that people who are neurodivergent face, as well as some of the things that they might even excel at. She mentioned her memory, to memorize things. It was really high. It was really easy for her to do studying and to pass tests, things like that, which is not something that I was necessarily good at. Because my brain worked differently than that person's and differently than other people also with ADHD as well. So the point of our activity that we're going to do now is kind of take this. There's also more videos if you're interested. So one of Greta Thunberg talking about her Asperger's as a strength. This talk here is not specifically about neurodivergence, but it is about differences and how you can capitalize on those differences. Essentially, he's a motivational speaker, but does use some research in his work. So pretty good. And then this one is specifically on ADHD and that neurodivergence. So if those are of interest to you and you want to look into them more, that would be good. So what we're going to do now is a little bit different than it says right here. Since we have only a couple students in this class, and it looks like we've got 5 here in class right now, I think rather than getting into small groups, what I'll have everybody do is pick any of these aspects of neurodiversity. So we talked about dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, we talked about ADHD, we talked about autism spectrum disorders. So pick one that's of interest to you, and essentially we're going to see if we can find any research on what people with that neurodivergence excel at. So either things that they excel at. So we talked about a couple things that people with ADHD might excel at. We talked about a couple things with people with autism might excel at. So either that, or you might look for examples in reports or interviews. So I know, for example, there's quite a few CEOs, like higher than average, who actually have dyslexia. And so some of them have done interviews and talked about how that neurodivergence has actually helped them focus on other things or learn in a different way that they feel help them in the business world. So either stories like that, or a better thing would be research, but I know we don't have a lot of time to do that. This is kind of like a mini question paper really quickly. And another thing you could look at is how we could adjust society to fit the needs of people who are using their brain slightly differently than neurotypical. So either of those, what they excel at, examples of people who feel that this neurodivergence has helped them, or how we can adjust society to fit their needs. So what we'll do is kind of just break off on our own, and you can keep this meeting open in the background, but go and look for some of those articles or some of those papers, some of those examples, and then we'll come back here at about 10, let's say 10:30. So 10 whole minutes to go and look for those things, 10:30, and also maybe before you go, type in the chat the thing that you're interested in, what neurodivergence you're going to look into, and then you can even talk with other people in the chat or here in this group of some things that you're finding. If you want to share, hey, I found this really interesting thing, and you want to share that link, that could be good too. So I'm trying this 2 different ways in both of my classes today to see how it works better in this kind of broadcast setting. So that's what we'll do right now. So just put in the chat before you go off and look at the information, which neurodivergence you're going to look into, and then at about 10:30 come back here to the big group meeting, or during the meantime you can share here in the big group meeting what you've been finding, and I will just not be talking. I know it's really hard for me. Also put any questions that you have about what you're supposed to be doing in the meeting chat. Hopefully that was clear though. Hi students, this is just a reminder to jump back into the class meeting in about a minute or two. So hopefully you found some good information and examples. All right, hopefully everybody is jumping back. Since we didn't jump into small group rooms, it's hard to see what people are on hold or here. So hopefully everybody is jumping back into the class meeting now. Let's find out any interesting things that you learned. So we had a lot of people that were looking into autism. So what was something interesting that you found out there? Some specific skills that it seems that people with that neurodivergent seem to have. Also, feel free to put it in the meeting chat if you don't want to use your microphone, but obviously microphone is going to be a little bit quicker.
Okay, well, I can start if you want me to. So I have some personal experience with some kids with autism. I've worked with kids in the past, and what I found is that a lot of kids, I was playing a game with one kid, and we were playing Settlers of Catan or something like that. And there are these chips that, you turn over and they have a letter on it, and that letter doesn't mean anything. You turn it over again, and that's the number that means something, right? I don't know if anyone's played Settlers of Catan, but if you have, you understand what I'm saying. But while you're placing your little chips, you don't see the numbers, and then you flip it over, and it's basically like, I don't know. Sorry, I'm just trying to think of the right word. You don't know what you're gonna get, basically. And so we'd played it once, we went back and we played it again, and he had memorized what the letters were, and he knew exactly what numbers were underneath them. And it was so impressive. And then you mentioning it later, I realized that, oh yeah, that's just how a lot of autistic kids are. And in my research, I found that their brains work a little differently when it comes to social expectation, which I find super awesome. And maybe I wish everyone had a little bit more of. But as someone who does not have autism, I have this expectation to look a certain way, to get a certain degree, or to do certain things with my life, or, act a certain way. Whereas someone with autism may not have that sort of a spectrum of society where they need to fit in some bubble. And that's something that I think they excel at, is that they don't have the need to feel like they need to fit in a certain bubble. So
yeah, really great examples there with the personal example, and then also that it can be a benefit to not have that kind of social pressure, and then if they have the opportunity to be able to choose to do what they want to do. So really great examples there. Thank you. Anyone else who was looking into autism that wanted to share something interesting that they learned about some of the things that people with that neurodivergence excel at? If not, well, let's move on to the next thing listed in the meeting chat was dyslexia. So did anyone find anything interesting about dyslexia? Also, a lot of times dyscalculia or dysgraphia is at the same time with dyslexia. So if you found anything with any of those neurodivergences, let me know. Go for it, Mackie. I saw you were raising your hand. It looks like Caitlin
So
put
I looked
a
up.
comment as well. So go for it, Mackie, and then I'll read Caitlin's comment.
Okay. So I looked up about dysgraphia because that's not really a super common one that you hear a lot. You know, you hear dyslexia more than any of the other three that were mentioned there in that category, so to speak. And something that I found that I thought was super interesting is dysgraphia is most often either undiagnosed or misdiagnosed because of how closely related dyslexia and dysgraphia are. Something I did also find that I thought was kind of interesting was that dysgraphia is often found more common in men than in women.
That is interesting. Thanks for letting us know that. I wasn't aware of the sex difference between those diagnoses. And then Caitlin mentions here, some people with dyslexia are better at seeing the bigger picture. They may excel at finding the odd one out, which is cool. And also, they might be great business entrepreneurs. Yeah, it's really interesting, the percentage of people who are entrepreneurs who have been successful that also have dyslexia. So obviously with the time that we have, it didn't give you enough time to find maybe 4 different research articles about it to see exactly the possible reasons for why that is. But I think if that's a question that's of interest to you, something that you could do. Also, I think you've done a really good job at seeing some of the different ways that these people's brains work just slightly different than a neurotypical brain. So maybe one of you or some of you have a neurodivergent brain, and maybe you learned a little bit more about yourself, or a way to support that, or to build some of your skills, or see that maybe you are thinking a little bit differently than other people. But another thing that I wanted to talk about was also that in society in general, we can do a better job, I think, at least in the US, I think there is a movement to be a lot more inclusive to a lot of other different groups. So I think this is another class of groups, essentially, people with neurodivergence, that we should realize that they have different skills and talents and abilities and specific challenges as well, that we can support them and help people excel in their lives and thrive. So with that, the last one is ADHD. I didn't see anybody mention that they were going to look into that. That's all right. But if anybody did, interrupt me and let me know if you want to share something that you found about it. All right. Well, then we will continue on. So Piaget's concrete operational stage. Think back to the examples we saw in the videos of children looking at water and not being able to do that mental reversal to understand that even though it's a different shaped glass or different shaped bowl, the same amount of liquid is in those two different things. So later on in life, Piaget said the concrete operational stage is from about 7 to 11, and it really is about that children can get an understanding of their cognitive environment because of concrete examples that they see presented in front of them. They don't necessarily have abstract thought yet, other than the fact that they can mentally reverse at this point in time. And so, like we've talked about before, a lot of children are able to do this before Piaget thought they could. Piaget also had different steps within this time of the concrete operational stage that he thought were also stage-like, so step 1, step 2, step 3 kind of things. And one thing that we've seen is that many children can do these processes in a different order than Piaget observed. So Piaget might have said it's 1, 2, 3, but a child might do 3, 2, 1, or that kind of thing. So with more modern research, we see that some of these observations still hold up, but we now don't have this stage-like idea. We focus more in the field on specific capacities and cognitive capacities. So let's talk about working memory. So this is one thing that we've mentioned quite a few times. I've given some examples, so hopefully you already have a pretty good idea of what working memory is. We're going to watch a little video, a little video about working memory that I think goes into it really well and gives a lot of good examples and has a couple different working memory activities for us to try during the video as well. So working memory is the newer descriptor and the newer idea around short-term memory. So short-term memory, the idea that we can hold certain information for like 20 to 30 seconds without working with it, that idea has been absorbed into working memory. You think of the working memory as your mental workbench, the space that you're consciously aware of, the sensations and perceptions. Well, you're getting those sensations in and you are interpreting those and having perceptions, maybe calling back previous information in the current moment. So when you are consciously aware of something happening, you are using your working memory. So they're very related, but your consciousness isn't necessarily your working memory, or working memory isn't necessarily your conscious mind, but it's really closely related. So let's say, for example, you have a sensation of light of maybe a dark shape in the corner of your eye. So off that way, you see something and it seems like it's moving. You might look at it and then have to decide, okay, that thing, what is it? So you're getting that sensation, so your working memory is active. You could think of those inside out characters at their table. They are, you are now trying to get more information, more data about this, more sensations, and you see it's a black shape and it's moving quickly. So with that, you will then use your sensations and perceptions. You'll pull back, maybe depending on its height, you'll call back previous memories, long-term memories. Maybe think, oh, this might be a dog. This might be a tire rolling down the street. This might be a child or something like that. So you pull these long-term memories, and you can compare. You can use your schemas at that moment. So your schemas are going to be active with your working memory as you're trying to determine what this is. And then based on that, you'll be able to get a clearer picture and then decide what to do. Maybe you then are afraid of whatever it is. If it's a tire rolling down the road all by itself quickly, then probably a good idea to be scared. Those things are pretty massive and can hurt people quite a bit. If it's a dog and it looks like it's happy, you might not be scared. If it's a dog and it looks angry, you might be scared. Those kinds of things. So this processing is happening within your working memory. You are calling back previous information. You're processing what's happening now, putting information together, making decisions. If you're talking to people, you're using your working memory to follow along with the conversation, to think about something to say, or to make a connection to something that happened to you in the past. So with this, in our working memory, we're actively using and modifying information. So hopefully that gives you a good description of working memory. The examples and descriptions in this video are even better than that. So if not, hopefully you'll be really clear on working memory at the end of this video. I'll watch it a little faster than it's actually recorded. So let me know if this is too fast for you, though.
So yesterday, I was out on the street in front of this building, and I was walking down the sidewalk, and I had company, several of us, and we were all abiding by the rules of walking down sidewalks. Okay, we're not talking to each other. We're facing forward. We're moving. When the person in front of me slows down, and so I'm watching him, and he slows down, and finally he stops. Well, that wasn't fast enough for me. So I put on my turn signal, and I walked around him. And as I walked, I looked to see what he was doing, and he was doing this. He was texting, and he couldn't text and walk at the same time. Now, we could approach this from a working memory perspective or from a multitasking perspective. We're going to do working memory today. Now, working memory is that part of our consciousness that we are aware of at any given time of day. You're doing it right now. It's not something we can turn off. If you turn it off, that's called a coma. Okay? So right now, you're doing just fine. Now, working memory has 4 basic components. It allows us to store some immediate experiences and a little bit of knowledge. It allows us to reach back into our long-term memory and pulls some of that in as we need it, mixes it, processes it in light of whatever our current goal is. Now, the current goal isn't something like I want to be president or the best surfer in the world. It's more mundane. I'd like that cookie. Or I need to figure out how to get into my hotel room. Okay? Now, working memory capacity is our ability to leverage that, our ability to take what we know and what we can hang on to and leverage it in ways that allow us to satisfy our current goal. Now, working memory capacity has a fairly long history, and it's associated with a lot of positive effects. People with high working memory capacity tend to be good storytellers. They tend to solve and do well on standardized tests, however important that is. Okay? They're able to have high levels of writing ability. They're also able to reason at high levels. So what we're going to do here is play a little bit with some of that. So I'm going to ask you to perform a couple tasks, and we're going to take your working memory out for a ride.
So do this at your own desk. He's going to give you a couple words to try and remember in that order. So see if you can remember them as you complete the other things that he asks of you. So let's actually do this, and we'll see if we get anybody who remembers all 5 words in the right order.
You up for that? Okay. I'm going to give you 5 words, and I just want you to hang on to them. Don't write them down. Just hang on to them. 5 words. While you're hanging on to them, I'm going to ask you to answer 3 questions. I want to see what happens with those words. So here's the words. Tree, highway, mirror, Saturn, and electrode. So far, so good? Okay. What I want you to do is I want you to tell me what the answer is to 23 times 8. Just shout it out. In fact, it's exactly. All right. I want you to take out your left hand, and I want you to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It's a neurological test, just in case you're wondering. All right. Now what I want you to do is to recite the last 5 letters of the English alphabet backwards. You should have started with Z. All right. How many people here are still pretty sure you've got all 5 words? Okay.
All right. So anybody who thinks they've got all those 5 words still, put them in the meeting chat. And try to get them in the same order. All right, I'm seeing the comments come in. So it looks like of the students here, we might have 2 that remembered 4 or 5. So that's pretty good. So that's a little less than half. I don't think I'm a good example for this one because I've watched this earlier today. So kind of cheated on it. But yeah, really good. It looks like 2 think that they've got them all. So yeah, tree, highway, mirror, and then Saturn. Sierra says something, so maybe the audio is just bad and maybe you heard something, or it might be that you were not remembering that one. And then electrode. So really good with that. So let's see about how many people generally do get all 5 of those. Okay, you didn't know what it was. That's fine. So 4 or 5 is really quite good.
Typically, we end up with about less than half, right? Which is normal. There'll be a range. Some people can hang on to 5, some can hang on to 10, some will be down to 2 or 3. What we know is this is really important to the way we function.
So, like you said, a little less than half, which is about what we saw in our class, tend to remember all 5. So we had a person remembering 4 and remembering them in the correct order. So I'd say that it's like 4.5, and then a person remembering 5. So really great job. For myself, generally 3 or 4 is about the max that I'm holding at any given time. And so we'll talk about working memory capacity and also some tools and techniques and specifically strategies to boost working memory capacity. So strategies to boost your working memory are really useful for studying in school, for processing new information, when you're reading a book, learning a new skill. A lot of things rely on working memory. So listen to these strategies and think about how you might use them, how you might already be using them without knowing that you are using a strategy. As an example, one strategy I use a lot is imagery. So human brains are really good at seeing pictures and imagining pictures. We use our visual senses a lot. So when I get these words, tree, highway, mirror, Saturn, and electrode, when I hear tree, immediately I have a visual image of a tree. It's a deciduous tree, so like green fluffy leaves up on top, brown trunk, and then highway, I see a highway. And so I put those together. I make them connected to one another. So I'm driving on a highway past a tree. And then the next one was mirror. Well, in a car or in a motorcycle, you've got mirrors. So I can look in the mirror. Generally in my mind, I'm in the car. And so I look in the mirror. And so tree, highway, mirror, all of those are connected together, pretty consistent storyline. And then Saturn, say, well, how does Saturn fit there? And so now my whole image changes to like a 80s album cover of like neon lights and things, and there's Saturn in the background on the horizon or something like that. That's where my brain goes to remember Saturn. And then around Saturn or around the rings, there's also an electrode. So it's all very 80s neon in my mind. And that's how I remember all 5 of those words using that strategy of imagery. So listen to the other strategies that he talks about. One that he doesn't name specifically is mnemonics. And hopefully we'll be able to talk about some examples of mnemonics later on in class too. Doing things like rhyming, acronyms. These are some examples of mnemonics and memory tricks that even though you might have this limited capacity of 4 things, those 4 things could be 4 chunks of information. So the more you chunk things together using different strategies, the more information you're going to be using in your working memory. So these strategies can be really useful in school and life in general. So let's listen to some of them.
You can hang on to 10, some will be down in 2 or 3. What we know is this is really important to the way we function. Okay? It's going to be really important here at TED because you're going to be exposed to so many different ideas. Now, the problem that we have is that life comes at us, and it comes at us very quickly. And what we need to do is to take that amorphous flow of experience and somehow extract meaning from it with a working memory that's about the size of a pea. Now, don't get me wrong, working memory is awesome. Okay? Working memory allows us to investigate our current experience as we move forward. It allows us to make sense of the world around us. Okay? But it does have certain limits. Now, working memory is great for allowing us to communicate. We can have a conversation, and I can build a narrative around that. So I know where we've been and where we're going and how to contribute to this conversation. Allows us to problem solve, critical think. We can be in the middle of a meeting, listen to somebody's presentation, evaluate it, decide whether or not we like it, ask follow-up questions. All of that occurs within working memory. It also allows us to go to the store and allows us to get milk and eggs and cheese when what we're really looking for is Red Bull and bacon. Okay? Got to make sure we're getting what we're looking for. Now, a central issue with working memory is that it's limited. It's limited in capacity, limited in duration, limited in focus. We tend to remember about 4 things. It used to be 7, but with functional MRIs, apparently it's 4. We were overachieving, all right? Now we can remember those 4 things for about 10 to 20 seconds unless we do something with it, unless we process it, unless we apply it to something, unless we talk to somebody about it. When we think about working memory, we have to realize that this limited capacity has lots of different impacts on us. Have you ever walked from one room to another and then forgotten why you're there? Okay. You do know the solution to that, right? You go back to that original room. Okay.
So he is playing this off as a joke because I'm sure all of us have had that experience. But it's actually one reason that this works is how your memory works. So if you're thinking about an idea in one room or you have something that you're thinking of in the one room, then you leave that room, you're now in a completely different context. If that idea has now left your working memory, coming back to that original room and being in that same environment, that same room, the same objects, it can literally prime that piece of information to come back into your working memory. So pulling it up from long-term memory or from, because it's connected now, those neurons are literally connected to that room that you were in. Sorry, this is more of a tangent than I intended to go on, but it's also relevant. So if you're in school, in an in-person school, let's say in a lecture hall, and we have this class, and then we have the exam in that classroom. You're going to end up doing better on the exam if you're sitting in the same chair you're always sitting in than if you move to a different chair on the day of the exam. Your specific space in that room will help prime memories from what you learned in that classroom. So this is another good thing. If you have like an office space or a desk or something that you're usually studying at, keeping that as a pattern and then taking the test in that same location. Since we're on this broadcast class, since you're either at home or somewhere like that and taking the test like that as well, taking the test in the same place you're learning the material will prime more memories too. So in reality, going back to the original room does actually help your memory and call up those long-term memories. So it's pretty interesting, and a good joke as well.
All right. Have you ever forgotten your keys? You ever forgotten your car? You ever forgotten your kids? Okay. Ever been involved in a conversation and you realize that the conversation to your left is actually more interesting? All right. So you're nodding and you're smiling, but you're really paying attention to this one over here until you hear that last word go up and you realize you've been asked a question. And you're really hoping the answer is no, because that's what you're about to say. Okay. All of that talks about working memory, what we can do and what we can't do. We need to realize that working memory has a limited capacity, and that working memory capacity itself is how we negotiate that. We negotiate that through strategies. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about a couple of strategies here. And these will be really important because you are now in a information target-rich environment for the next several days. Right? Now, the first part of this is that we need to think about and we need to process our existence, our life, immediately and repeatedly. We need to process what's going on the moment it happens, not 10 minutes later, not a week later, at the moment. So we need to.
So one way I like to think about this, and hopefully this helps, is if you've ever watched a show on Netflix or Hulu or something and you get buffering. Hopefully you're not, hopefully your internet connection's better than that, but sometimes I get buffering. And essentially you don't, with your working memory, you don't have time to buffer. Essentially you need to be using your working memory in a consistent stream. So if you have buffering, then you're going to miss things. You're going to miss things in a conversation. You're going to miss something in the environment. If you've ever spaced out, that's kind of similar to this analogy here, that you were buffering for a little bit. Now you're trying to catch up, and that can be more difficult with your working memory.
Later, not a week later, at the moment. So we need to think about, well, do I agree with him? Okay. What's missing? What would I like to know? Do I agree with the assumptions? How can I apply this in my life? It's a way of processing what's going on so we can use it later. Now, we also need to repeat it. We need to practice. So we need to think about it here. In between, we want to talk to people about it. You're going to write it down. When you get home, pull out those notes and think about them and end up practicing over time. Practice, for some reason, became a very negative thing. It's very positive. The next.
So this is, sorry, I know I keep pausing the video. But this is one of the reasons I ask you to review your notes before the next exam or before the final exam, because that is allowing you to practice the material. Maybe the things that you've learned since then will help you make new connections, things like that.
Next thing is, we need to think elaboratively and we need to think illustratively. Oftentimes we think that we have to relate new knowledge to prior knowledge. What we want to do is spin that around. We want to take all of our existence and wrap it around that new knowledge and make all of these connections, and it becomes more meaningful. We also want to use imagery. We are built for images. We need to take advantage of that. Think about things in images. Write things down that way. If you read a book, pull things up. I just got through reading The Great Gatsby, and I have a perfect idea of what he looks like in my head. So my own version. The last one is organization and support. We are meaning-making machines. It's what we do. We try to make meaning out of everything that happens to us. Organization helps. So we need to structure what we're doing in ways that make sense. If we are providing knowledge and experience, we need to structure that. And the last one is support. We all start as novices. Everything we do is an approximation of sophistication. We should expect it to change over time. We have to support that. The support may come in asking people questions, giving them a sheet of paper that has an organizational chart on it or has some guiding images, but we need to support it. Now, the final piece of this, the take-home message from a working memory capacity standpoint is this. What we process, we learn. If we're not processing life, we're not living it. Live life. Thank you.
So a lot of the things that he's saying there with the strategies, he's going over them pretty briefly, but you can go and do more research on all those strategies, like imagery. There's tons of papers and books written about research on these specific topics. So using the things like that, things like mnemonics, using your previous knowledge and wrapping it around the things that you're learning now is really good to do for your notes for classes. But this is also relevant for your experience in life. If you're learning a new skill or trying to build a talent, or just having a conversation with someone, being more present and involved and taking in this information and making it relevant and meaningful to you at that time is going to be engaging, more engaging for your working memory. So hopefully you can also see, thinking about the history of psychology and how theories change over time. The older theory was short-term memory. We had about 20 or 30 seconds. If we didn't use that information, it was gone. Now we understand, and we've kind of absorbed that idea into working memory. So working memory, any sensation that comes in, we can hold on to it for about 20 or 30 seconds. If we don't work with it, if we don't elaborate on it, if we don't use one of these strategies, it's not going to go into long-term memory. So, and working memory also describes a lot of the ways we process other cognitive information, and is really taking multiple theories and kind of combining them together to a better, newer theory that better describes all of these things, as well as the new data that was coming in. So hopefully that makes it clear as well. I know it's been a long time since we talked about how theories work, but yeah. So questions about working memory? I will actually write down. I always fail at spelling mnemonics. Is that correct? Oh, no, it's not. It's giving me there we go. Mnemonics. So I've put in the chat how to spell mnemonics if you want to search for some mnemonics. Similar to what we were talking about before with individualized attention. So find mnemonics that work for you. I've tried a bunch of mnemonics that just don't work for me, but I found a few that work pretty well. So there's a lot of different kinds of mnemonics you can use. So figure out the ones that work for you, and it'll help you make a list and memorize something, or internalize the information from a class. So I definitely encourage you to look up a bunch of different mnemonics and give them a try, and figure out things. Try a lot of new ones, maybe one at a time, kind of systematically, like study it yourself, which mnemonics work for me. All right, with that, I think all of the information here we just covered in that video. So elaboration is the building of the info, thinking of examples, making it relevant to you, wrapping around old knowledge to new knowledge. Mental imagery, just like the example I gave of how I was remembering those 5 words. Children are a lot better. Older children are better. They've had more time to use visual information, to practice using their working memory. It's also really relevant to you at your stage in life as well. And then understanding the material rather than just memorizing it. Obviously for some, let's say you're a doctor taking some classes in preparation for your entire degree. So you might have an anatomy class. You'll almost definitely have an anatomy class. In that class, you'll probably have to memorize however many of the bones are in the body. I think there's 300 or something. But you'll probably have to memorize all of those. So at first, you're probably just trying to memorize that. But hopefully over time, through the work that you're doing, that doctor will be able to understand all the bones in the hands, how it's related to the muscles and the tendons around them. Well, I guess the muscles are up here, but how it's related to the tendons and the muscles, and all the systems are working together. So combining all that information to understand it rather than just memorize the lists of bones and where they are. So this is also relevant to you learning these new things in class. So working memory is something that I definitely like to give students a lot more information about than is in the book, because it's really relevant to how you're going to live your lives. No matter what kind of field you're in, you're going to be using your working memory. Like the person said in the video, if you're not using your working memory, it probably means you're in a coma. So it's one of those capacities we can build at any point in our life, and it'll be really useful. All right, so moving from working memory to expertise. It might seem strange to you to think about expertise in middle and late childhood stages of life, but this is where we start to see expertise can appear for the first time. So what this means is an expert is a person with extensive knowledge in a specific kind of content area. When you have someone who has expertise, let's say you have expertise in physics or in paleontology or in psychology, all of those were fields that start with P. Interesting. Also ones that I was interested in throughout my life. So someone who's an expert in any of those given fields knows how to attend to important information, knows what's most pertinent, has already structures or cognitive schemas to organize things, so they're able to learn quicker in that area, interpreting information. They can solve problems around that expertise a lot easier. They can reason about that topic. They probably have more content in their memory about that topic, so it's easier to pull up that information. This is actually really related to experts feeling like they're experts and people who know a little bit about a topic feeling like they might be experts. It's called the Dunning-Kruger effect, but I don't have any slides on that right now. Maybe I'll bring it up in a second, though. My brain's jumping different places that I'm trying to connect to. So with this, in middle and late childhood, a child might gain expertise in a topic. You may have, for example, met a child who knows more than you even knew existed about dinosaurs as a possibility. You can have an expert in playing the piano or painting. You can have expertise in just about any area. And the first time developmentally in the lifespan that we see expertise is towards late childhood. So this isn't to say every single child is going to become an expert in one thing or another thing, just that they now at that point in life have that capacity. So this is something that might seem unusual to you, or you might have seen stories about a child prodigy in some area. Well, obviously not every single child is going to be interested enough to become an expert or have the supports and the materials available to them to become an expert guitar player or something like that. But I do want to remind everybody that children have these capacities. So a middle or late child should be supported in the things that they're interested in, should have a lot of opportunities to try different things according to what they would like to do. And if they continue on with something, they absolutely could become an expert in it, even in late childhood, which I think is pretty neat. We'll talk about other ways in adolescence that a lot of people just generally, adults mostly, look at adolescence as a negative thing and don't give adolescents the credit they deserve, essentially. We do similar things for children as well. We don't always give children the credit they deserve. They have a lot of capacities, and if we support them, it can be really good for them and also for the world as well. So again, the older you are in late childhood, the more likely you are to become an expert. So since I'm thinking of the Dunning-Kruger effect, maybe I can find a graph really quickly and explain that, how it's related to expertise. Interesting. I think this specific graph was actually in one of my undergrad textbooks about Dunning-Kruger effect. Interesting. I wonder if the textbook plagiarized this or if this website just took it from that source. Let's see, how do I zoom here? Let's make it a little bigger. It's a little too big. So expertise is on this, and we have wisdom here, but this also applies to expertise and great knowledge in one area. So expertise would be somewhere around here on this dimension of line. This dimension is confidence. So very interestingly, I don't know of Dunning-Kruger effect research done with middle and late children, only for adults, so like 18 and over. So I don't know if this actually applies to middle and late childhood, but it is an interesting phenomenon. As people learn a little bit about a topic, so here knowing very little to knowing quite a lot, when people know a little bit about a topic, they tend to feel like they know a lot. They are very confident in their knowledge. It's not till you learn even more that you realize that there are so many more connections around a topic. There's so much information and depth to content that you don't realize. I felt this way myself, like when I started in the field of psychology. I had done maybe 3 years of undergrad, and so I'd taken like one of each course, like a cognitive course, a social course, a developmental course, abnormal psych course, and I felt like I knew a whole lot. And then as I went into grad school, I realized there was so much more that I did not know. I still feel like I'm probably over here, honestly, in my knowledge, versus someone at the end of their career or an expert in a field is over here, and they don't feel maybe as confident in the knowledge they have, even though they have quite a bit more knowledge. So it's an interesting effect that adults show, and relevant to expertise. Again, I'm not sure if that same effect applies to children or in middle or late childhood, but it is relevant to expertise. So I thought I might share that really quickly. All right. So the next thing we'll talk about is creative thinking. So oftentimes we think of creativity in the sense of art, being creative in music or painting or something like that. But really, creative thinking, as defined by psychologists, is the ability to think in novel and unusual ways. So you might say it's thinking outside the box, being able to come up with novel or different solutions to problems, and you can do that in any kind of domain. So you can do that in physics, you could do that in programming, you could do that in tree trimming. So there's lots of different ways to be creative, not just art like we usually think of it. So yeah, coming up with unique solutions to problems. One interesting thing is that people tend to be creative in one specific domain themselves. So a person who is really creative in art might not be very creative in math. And this tends to line up really well with what they have expertise in. When you have expertise, when you have a lot of information to pull back from, when you have a lot of information to contextualize new information, you're going to be a little better at problem solving. You might be able to think of a creative solution to a problem better. But you could use creativity. You could be really creative in solving programming problems. So maybe you make apps or make programs, and there's something just not working, and you think of a really creative way to get around that. The other day, I watched a really interesting video of someone who wanted to make basically a robot pool cue to basically shoot the cue ball to make a shot. And in doing that, they had to solve a bunch of engineering problems, and they did it in really unusual ways. So they used a lot of creativity in that specific domain. Would they be as creative in art? Well, the research says probably not, right? So you're probably creative in one specific domain. It's unusual for someone to be creative in a lot of different domains. And a lot of times it does line up with things that we are becoming or are experts in. So some also creativity as well as expertise. While we're talking about this in middle and late childhood, these are cognitive capacities that can be built later on in life as well, all through adolescence, all through adulthood, even into late adulthood. So becoming an expert in something new in late adulthood is actually one thing that is really, really related to extending lifespan. I hope we'll have time to watch a video of a person as we get to the end of life, who is in their late 90s and says about every 2 years they try to become an expert in something new. In the video at the time, they're doing photography, and they've become an expert in micro photography because it's something that they can do in their own home. So interestingly, you can become an expert, you can be creative, you can develop new creativities and new expertise all throughout lifespan, which I think is a really positive, optimistic way to think about life, even though, as we'll talk about at the end of life, that person was losing physical capacities, but their cognitive capacities were staying incredibly sharp and even growing. All right, so let's talk for a couple minutes about intelligence. This is a really good video that has a summary of a lot of the points that the book makes. Some of the main points that I want to make are that when we first started looking at intelligence, we were looking for IQ, or an intelligence quotient. And so some one number that kind of described people's intelligence overall. Over time, we've realized that, well, one specific number doesn't really describe all the ways that people can have intelligence. So more recent research in intelligence looks at intelligence through different dimensions. And you might be high in a couple of those dimensions and low in a couple of those dimensions. You might be kind of medium on all of them. So there's a lot of different ways that intelligence can appear. Another thing with intelligence, the original studies of intelligence had some of the same problems as original studies in psychology. A lot of the original studies in psychology used exclusively middle class, white, college male samples. So that's a pretty unique group. Those who are in that socioeconomic status, those who are that ethnicity, and in a college setting. So that's a small group of people. It's not necessarily generalizable to any other group. So over time, we've done a lot better job at doing our research to be inclusive of lots of different people as well as lots of different cultures. So some of the problems with original IQ tests were those that were the same problems as original psych theory. So one of the first theories that kind of looked at intelligence in multiple dimensions was Sternberg's triarchic theory. He said we have analytical intelligence, which we can judge, evaluate, compare, and you could be high or low on that. So that could be related to your shopping and looking on Amazon for something new, and you're trying to determine or evaluate, is this thing better than this thing, or you're in a store and doing that. It could also be analyzing and actually doing math or something like that. Creative intelligence, this goes back to creativity that we just talked about, solving problems in novel ways, being able to invent or design or imagine. And then there was this practical intelligence, which you and I might talk about as common sense. So Sternberg thought that the ability to use and apply and actually use ideas in day-to-day life was practical intelligence. So you can see these three dimensions are a lot more specific than one general IQ number. So you could have one number and say someone has 100 IQ points. Or you can say, well, their analytical intelligence is high, but their practical intelligence is low. So that's a lot more descriptive, and that could be related to a lot of personality characteristics. It could be related to their developmental trajectory. So it's a lot better and a lot more accurate to look at these multiple dimensions. Some of the dimensions that are more recent in research are Gardner's 8 frames of mind. So verbal intelligence, there's things like reading, writing, speaking, multiple languages, things like that. Mathematical intelligence, pretty self-explanatory, calculating, actually using math. Spatial intelligence, so that would, someone who's high in spatial intelligence would probably be good at the game of Tetris, would probably be really good at packing the back of a car as you're trying to go on your vacation and you have too much stuff. Bodily kinesthetic intelligence, you'd see that high in, say, a high-level dancer, gymnast, parkour athlete. They know where their body is, how it's moving within space. Musical intelligence, pretty self-explanatory as well. You probably see people who are high and experts in singing or playing instruments, high in musical intelligence. I always get interpersonal and intrapersonal mixed up. One is intelligence and understanding your own self. One is understanding like groups of people. So, but I always mix up the words. So refer to your book for those. Then naturalist intelligence, you could say that's similar to the practical intelligence from Sternberg. So naturalist intelligence, using and applying things in an actual environment. So if you have a lot of knowledge, can you then apply that in any given kind of situation? So you can see any given person from this 8 frames of mind might be really low in musical intelligence, but might be really high in interpersonal intelligence. So you might be at about medium for all of those, or high for a group of 3 and low for others. So this is where the research in IQ is right now. And I think it's a lot better to look at these multiple dimensions of people and understand that people can have their expertise in specific areas, that they can excel in things and be not excelling in things. And then for those who aren't excelling in maybe musical intelligence, if that's something that they want to work on, we can support people in doing that. Or if that's not anything they care about, well, that's not any negative thing on that person. So I think the newer ideas around intelligence are a lot more useful, and the studies around it are a lot more methodologically rigorous. I mean, generally methods have just gotten better as we've done a better and better job of doing science. So that's a lot of information really quickly about intelligence. Hopefully you've already read about it in your book, so this isn't new information. One other thing for intelligence, it doesn't have a very high correlation to your genetics or your heredity. So it seems like most of your intelligence is learned behavior, learned experience. So someone who has more opportunities to try things out might be higher on those kinds of forms of intelligence. This is probably one reason that we see people with low SES have lower IQs in general, or any of these specific dimensions, is probably because the lack of opportunity to learn new things, or not as many resources in their community to try and do more music, for example. IQ is rising in general on average around the world, which is nice. That might be partially methodologically. We're measuring it better and more accurately in all different populations. It also might be that we have better education systems now, so everyone's IQ is just kind of going up. It also seems for any given IQ point, we generally see about a jump of 4 points per year of college. So if everyone's getting better educated, everyone's IQs are going to be going up. Intellectually stimulating environments in early childhood are really highly related to high IQ. So the more opportunities, the more engagement, the more chances a child has to engage with different things, the higher their IQ will be, because they will have that chance to pursue those interests. And this is relevant into adolescence as well. So when we ever talk about group differences, we might mention something like these group differences. Here, I'm going to get to the bigger graph. So you might have a paper that says there's a statistically significant difference between IQ. Well, let's look at two of these groups. Let's look at the light blue and the yellow here. So the light blue is other, so basically anyone whose ethnicity did not fit into these 4 categories. And then yellow is Hispanic. So you might say there's a statistically significant difference here, and it's probably a point value of maybe 6 or 7. So when you're looking at a group or a sample of 4,000 people, there might be a statistically significant difference there. But what I want to emphasize is how much overlap there is here. So even in older IQ studies that weren't as good, the main thing that we can see is there's a lot of similarity. And then there's a big range of people's IQ capacity as well. So I think that's a lot more inspiring than thinking that any given group has lower IQ. It's that, well, there's a lot of overlap here, and any individual's capacity or opportunities is going to have a bigger impact than anything like their ethnicity. It's going to be down to what kind of opportunities they're provided with. So lots of stuff really quickly. We're out of time now, but that is the end of this chapter. We'll jump into chapter 8 next time. Any questions though before you go? Feel free to put them in the chat as well. All right, well, I hope you learned some new things today about working memory that can help you in your day-to-day life. Have a good rest of your day and a good weekend this weekend.